What's going on, YouTube? Welcome back, everyone. This is Lee, and today we'll be talking about the Viltrox 56mm 1.7 versus the Sigma 56mm 1.4. So, with all that said, let's begin. So right before we get started, I just want to point out that Viltrox, they did send this unit to me for evaluation, and as usual, all opinions are my own opinions about the product. Also, I went to pick up the Sigma for this test. So with all of that out the way, let's take a look at some specs. So the Sigma versus the Viltrox, let's talk about price. Now, the Sigma comes in at 500 USD, and that is for the Z-mount version only, whereas the Viltrox comes in at 140 USD, and that's also for the Z-mount. So if you're buying the Sigma, just know that the Z-mount is 500. I know that the other mounts are a lot cheaper, so keep that in mind. Now, the Sigma sports a 1.4 aperture, whereas the Viltrox sports a 1.7. They both have 9 blades. However, the Sigma is 55mm filter thread, whereas the Viltrox is 52mm filter thread. Also, this is very important. This will play throughout the whole test. The Sigma has 10 elements. 10 elements. The Viltrox has 11 elements. Also, the Sigma has weather seal, whereas the Viltrox do not have weather seal. However, the Viltrox do have a USB-C port where you could update the firmware, whereas the Sigma, there's no docking station for the Z-mount. However, I did contact Sigma about this, and they did tell me that they're planning to do a firmware update through the camera to the lens, so keep that in mind. Now, the Sigma do offer a 1-year warranty, whereas the Viltrox also offer a 1-year warranty. However, if you're in the States, you get a 3-year warranty by Sigma. So, with all that said, let's take a look at some tests. Now, as for the first test, let's take a look at the weight. The Viltrox weighs about 185 grams, whereas the Sigma weighs about 288 grams. But once you add up all the accessories to the scale, the Viltrox is still lighter than the Sigma at 222 grams, whereas the Sigma is 340 grams. Now, as for the lens hood, the Sigma is made a lot longer than the Viltrox, also a lot sturdier than the Viltrox. And as for the focus ring, the Sigma sports a rubber focus ring, whereas the Viltrox sports a plastic focus ring, so keep that in mind. And as for the next test, this is the chromatic aberration test. There's 3 things you guys should know about this test. Number 1, I am shooting directly at an aluminum roof where the sun is beaming on it. So this is the worst case scenario, all right? Number 2, there is focus breathing on the Viltrox, so keep that in mind. Number 3, the background of the Viltrox renders a lot more clearer than the Sigma, but we're talking about chromatic aberration, but I just want to let you guys know about that. Now, looking at the chromatic aberration test, I would have to say that the Sigma do have slight chromatic aberration issues in this intense test, but around 2.8, it kind of clears up. The Viltrox at 1.7 seems to handle it very well, so that is really good on the Viltrox. And as for the next test, this is the distortion test, and Sigma is offering their consumers a lot of distortion in their image. So if you can, turn on your in-camera distortion fix or do it in post, whereas the Viltrox, it looks pretty great, but definitely you guys could fix all this in post, obviously. So not a big deal, but something for you guys to know. And as for the next test, this is the vignetting test. I'm shooting at this transmission tower on a cloudy day with no lens hood on. The Viltrox is displaying abundance of vignetting, whereas the Sigma is pretty clear on the edges. So with that in mind, just like the Sigma for the distortion test, Viltrox, you need to fix that up in post. So I guess in the end, Sigma, terrible distortion, Viltrox, terrible vignetting, but who knows, maybe some of you guys might enjoy the vignetting on the Viltrox, maybe some of you guys might enjoy the distortion on the Sigma, so it's really up to personal preference at this point, right? So there we go. And as for the next test, this is the flare test. I'm shooting directly at the bush, 90 degrees. No lens hood, sun is directly in front of me, and this is 1.4 versus 1.7 on the Viltrox, and already the Sigma has more flare than the Viltrox. However, at 1.8 versus 1.8, the Sigma clearly has less flare than the Viltrox, and throughout the rest of the aperture, it looks more or less the same. Now, as for the next test, this is the bokeh ball test. I'll let you guys decide, since this is very subjective right here, the bokeh balls, to see how round the balls are. But I will say though, around 2.8, the Viltrox has bigger balls. So that is something I want to point out, but I'll let you guys decide on your own on this portion right here. Now as for the next test, here is the background bokeh. I'm going to let you guys decide for yourself, just like the bokeh ball test, because this is very subjective to me. But the Viltrox is slightly further away due to its focus breathing, so the bokeh blur is not 1-for-1, so keep that in mind. But I'm going to let you guys decide on your own. Leave a comment down below as to which one you guys prefer. And as for the next test, here is the lens sharpness test. But right before we get started, a lot of you guys have asked me to shoot a picture board so I can like show you guys the actual sharpness of the lens. But the problem with that is, if you're just shooting a picture board, to pretend this is the picture board, you're just shooting at one plane of an image. This only works well for those people that shoot like walls. If you're just shooting nothing but a plain wall, then that will work for you. But even film scanners, that will work for you. But in an actual landscape, you got depth, right? You got depth, you got foreground, you got background, you got midground, you got depth, right? So shooting a picture board is not a good way to test out your lens. So let me show you guys, because Viltrox actually can prove it to you guys right here. So here is Sigma 1.4 versus 1.7. Already right off the bat, I would say that the Viltrox, the color is slightly darker than the Sigma, and also the background of the Viltrox at 1.7 is slightly more in focus than the Sigma. And here is Sigma 1.8 versus Viltrox at 1.7. And as you can see, the color on the Viltrox is just a tad darker than the Sigma. And as you can see, the background is more sharper on the Viltrox at 1.7 versus the Sigma at 1.8. Now here's 2.8. Already right off the bat, Viltrox is a tad darker than the Sigma, and also the background is more in focus on the Viltrox than the Sigma. Here is f4, and the story more or less remains the same. The Viltrox is still a tad darker than the Sigma, and also the background is more in focus on the Viltrox than the Sigma. Here is 5.6, and I'll have to say that still Viltrox background is still more in focus than the Sigma. That is wild. That is crazy. You get a sharper background on the Viltrox. Now as for f8, I would say that the Viltrox and the Sigma more or less looks the same, but due to the slight darkness on the Viltrox, I could see slightly more detail on the Viltrox versus Sigma, just a tad more, but more or less they are the same. And here's f11. I would say that the scene in terms of sharpness is more or less the same, but the color on the Viltrox is a tad darker than the Sigma. Also, I would have to say that the focus breathing is still there, so just keep in mind. And here's f16, it's more or less the same as f11. So as for the next test, here is the minimum focus test. As you can clearly see right off the bat, the Sigma, you could get closer to your subject than the Viltrox. Minimum focus distance on the Sigma is 19.5, the Viltrox is 21.5, and also the sculpture there is 7.5 inches high and 4 inches wide. But here's a comparison for you guys that are curious when it comes to a human being. I think that two of the eyes here is probably one of my eyes in terms of size. So there we go. Now as for the next test, this is the portrait test, but there's two things you guys should definitely know. Number one, I'm using continuous lighting. Number two, I actually nudged the Viltrox 4 inches forward than the Sigma so I can compensate for the focus breathing. So here's 1.4 versus 1.7. Right off the bat, I would have to say that the Viltrox at 1.7 is slightly sharper than the 1.4 on the Sigma. Here is 1.8 versus 1.8. I would have to say that definitely the Viltrox might be a tad sharper than the Sigma, give or take. At 2.8, yeah, the Viltrox, just like the playground scene, it looks a tad darker than the Sigma. Here is f4. Yeah, I actually prefer the Viltrox. And here is 5.6. And here is f8. Here is f11. I do notice slight diffraction on the Sigma, but the Viltrox is a tad sharper, just a little bit, just a tiny bit if you're pixel peeping. And here is f16. I would have to say, yeah, it's more or less like I said before. The colors on the Viltrox slightly, just a tad darker than the Sigma. It's a tad sharper on the Viltrox than the Sigma at f16. So just wrap things up, the Sigma versus the Viltrox at the end of the day is 140 bucks versus $500. You could buy 3 Viltrox lenses for 1 Sigma lens, or just, you know, keep that 1 Viltrox lens and take care of it, and it lasts you for the next how many years, because Sigma comes with what, 3-year warranty for US people, but 1 year for everyone else. So just keep that in perspective. This is about the type of buyers are looking for these type of lenses. If you're looking for like more bokeh, more autofocus and low light situation, I'll point to you guys to the Sigma, which also has weather resistance, right? But if you're looking for a sharper lens that can, you know, render out more depth in the scene, Viltrox is the way to go. So if I'm shooting a portrait, I'm taking the Viltrox any day. I'm taking the Viltrox. If I'm shooting landscape, I'm taking the Viltrox. If I am shooting at a low light dinner party, probably the Sigma. Most likely the Sigma, right? If I'm going outdoors on a rainy day, I would take the Sigma, but if I only had the Viltrox, just cover it up with a lens cover. So that's, you know, how you work around that. So 140 bucks versus 500 bucks, I'll leave it to you guys on that, all right? But anyways, thank you guys for checking me back. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Definitely click like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one, all right? Take it easy. Peace.